Chainsaw Man Part 2 is better than Part 1. I don't think it is now because of the recent chapters, although those did help, but I've always preferred Part 2 to Part 1. And it's kind of what raised my score of Chainsaw Man from an 8 to a 9. I'm not gonna break down why exactly Part 2 is fundamentally better than Part 1, but instead celebrate a lot of the things that I think it does exponentially well. I've been wanting to talk about this for a hot minute because while there are definitely fans of it, I don't think there's enough people really giving Part 2 the respect I think it deserves. And over the course of its run, I've seen a lot of criticism and disappointment come from its fans. I'll go on to try and understand some of the dissatisfaction or qualms that people may have had with Chainsaw Man, but there's just so much this story does right in my eyes that I can't help but gush about it. Now, while it's important to bring this point up, I don't want to use it to boil down all Part 2 criticism as, it's actually perfect, you just have the attention span of a goldfish, you don't understand Part 2, but it's a major point of contention when regarding Part 2 discussion, so let's just get this out of the way. Yes, Part 2 is very different from Part 1. From the slow pacing, to the energy, to the structure, words, Part 2 is approaching a very different style of storytelling to Part 1, which can understandably turn a lot of people off. But from the get-go, I've been a massive fan of this shift in focus, examining the everyday life struggles mixed in with that classic Fujimoto insanity. Something about Part 2 and its writing feels more human. I don't know how to describe it. Having these slower and more intimate scenes that allow characters to really ponder and think is an approach I love. This is something that has always been present in Chainsaw Man, but because of the more slice-of-life elements present in early Part 2, combined with the slower pacing, I feel like we now have much more of these moments than usual, and more elaboration on things like Denji's character, for example. Denji has been significantly growing and regressing as a person as we watch his past trauma really come back to haunt him. Watching elements like Denji's sexual deprivation get in the way of him being happy, or him indirectly causing the people around him to get hurt, watching these things come full circle is extremely satisfying and shows me that Fujimoto fundamentally understands the things that make Denji a great character. That's always been one of my favorite aspects of Part 2, how it feels different but still builds off of the foundation set by Part 1. Certain elements from Part 1 come back in a new light. The suffering Denji indirectly causes other people, minor characters from Part 1 having a bigger role in Part 2, just even something as simple as just callbacks to previous events. I'm kind of a sucker for that, I'm not gonna lie. And even something like Denji potentially finding love. Asa Mitaka is a great character, and a really good example of what I was talking about when it comes to building off of Part 1's foundation. We know that Denji throughout the entire series has been manipulated and deceived by people throughout his life. It's become a very big talking point in the community, especially as of recent. Then here comes our new protagonist, Asa, someone who isn't a master manipulator and isn't particularly good at swooning people either. She is a socially awkward teenager who, like Denji, went through her own share of troubles. She's not a control devil or someone who's out to steal Chainsaw Man's heart. She is a regular high schooler who has trouble making friends and struggles to find reasons to keep going. But through all this, it is Denji who inspires her to keep going and find something to live for, which leads to Asa returning the favor. And what I love about her is not just the fact that she's badass and entertaining in her own way, but also that from my point of view, she will be the one to break this cycle. She is not like the other love interests Denji has had. She can relate to Denji in a way that no other character can. Her personality bounces off of his authentically. She catches feelings for him before even realizing he's Chainsaw Man, and wants to help him have a normal life. All Denji wants is for someone to love him not because he's Chainsaw Man, but because he's Denji. And to me, Asa is the answer he's looking for. But as we all know, the big thing that is getting in the way of them is Yoru.
Hold up! Each history's greatest monster!
Yoru and her dynamic with Asa is extremely interesting to see unfold, and a very unique take on the inner demon trope. Let's take Jujutsu Kaisen. As much as I love Yuji and Sukuna as individual characters, I wouldn't really say I like them that much as a dynamic, since they don't really interact too much, which makes sense because, well, you know, They hate each other, but because of this, I don't think they truly benefit nor suffer as a result of being one. But I think Fujimoto really plays with the idea of Asa and Yoru being one body, more than other authors I've seen. He really allows for Asa and Yoru to constantly bounce off of each other in both more serious and mundane situations. Which is of course done to show us their differences in perspective, but you can also see that their relationship is pretty complex, especially since their perspectives are not exactly black and white. To me, Yoru is not just evil for the sake of it. Behind these terrible acts and selfishness, there's this looming thread of insecurity within her, sparks of human emotions even if she doesn't fully understand them. Due to many of the events of Part 2, Asa and Yoru have developed an interesting relationship. They're clearly polar opposites, but have also developed somewhat of a fondness for one another. There is some evidence to suggest that Yoru has grown to like Asa. Likewise, Asa has grown accustomed to Yoru while still being reminded that in the end, she's a devil. It becomes even more enticing when their personalities begin to merge. Yoru starts doing things she wouldn't normally do as a result of Asa's emotions, and how this begins to really tear them apart. We see different sides of Yoru. We see her take on more human emotions. As a result of all of this, Asa and Yoru have developed such a unique chemistry and have become one of my favorite uses of the inner demon trope. Aside from other elements you could pick apart, I would say that these three characters are at the core of what makes Part 2 so engaging. To me. So, like, for real, what am I seeing in this story that you guys aren't? Chainsaw Man Part 2, through the midst of its run, has definitely received pretty underwhelming reactions. Before really getting into the nitty-gritty, most people when talking about Part 2 just found it to be boring, or they just lost interest, which, yeah, that's fair. You can't really get mad at someone for that, but I did want to look into specific reasons on this feeling of dissatisfaction. To me, there are two major problems with Part 2 that I'm on y'all's side when it comes to this, with one not really affecting the series as a whole, but the other kinda does. 1. The release schedule for Chainsaw Man is not very good. If this schedule results in better conditions for Fujimoto, as well as more time to give him to piece together the story, I'm all for it. But it is a double-edged sword, as it greatly affects the hype surrounding Chainsaw Man as we wait and wait for a chapter that may or may not even be all that exciting. I've been keeping up with Chainsaw Man Part 2 since the beginning, and the fatigue hasn't really gotten to me because I don't really suffer from weekly fatigue as much as other people do, but it's undeniable that this has played a part in people's disinterest and has definitely affected the hype of the story. And 2, the art's gotten worse. Chainsaw Man's art and just general presentation is definitely a culprit as to why people were losing interest in the series, at least from my point of view. Not even just the rendering of the drawings, the way things are portrayed is extremely flat and stiffer than usual, and just not very pretty to look at. Like, bro, can you please turn on the pressure sensitivity on your tablet? Why is the line width all the same? Why are the motion lines so uniform and basic? It just looks gross. It looks nasty. This is not a knock on Fujimoto at all, because even with this schedule, I'm sure having to draw and write all this must be very straining to his health. I get it. I hope the best for him, for sure. But I think my point still stands. It just makes scenes that should be fueling hype or excitement end up not stirring as much emotion in viewers as it should be. I don't want to sit here and say that if Chainsaw Man was drawn by, I don't know, fucking Yusuke Murata, it would be perfect and nobody would have any complaints. But it's very clear that a lot of the disengagement from fans has come from the fact that the presentation has been lacking. Like, it's really lacking. Leaning more towards the story side of things, one thing I've heard thrown around is that for a while, Part 2 felt a bit aimless, sort of lacking in an end goal. I understand this feeling, but I still felt like the events in the story were enjoyable enough to keep me going regardless, and in my eyes, there were always sparks of a plan while also not feeling too disjointed. I don't know, I never felt like Chainsaw Man really went off the rails. I always felt like the momentum of the story was pretty controlled and meticulous. It feels like this nice trade-off of the uncontrollable adrenaline and mayhem of Part 1 for a more congruent and smoother experience. But hey, like, I could be completely wrong because I'm not Fujimoto and I don't know what he's thinking when he's writing Chainsaw Man. and because there are some stories that I thought had a much bigger plan at play, and by the end I came to the harsh reality that the author was kinda just making stuff up as he went along and the entire story fell flat on its feet. I also found that people were not really vibing with the events of the Jailbreak and Chainsaw Man Church arcs. It definitely seems like a lot of the problems people have with part 2 are coming more so from this middle section, sort of after the Falling Devil arc and before the current arc. This is where people were getting this feeling of aimlessness of the story, and when Chainsaw Man's art really starts to decline. I actually really did enjoy these arcs for what they were, but I will admit that they aren't necessarily my favorite parts of Chainsaw Man Part 2. My favorite sections are still the first and current acts. I always go back to skim through those first batch of chapters, especially the Aquarium Date, the Falling Devil arc. Those are some of my favorites. And I suppose the more character-driven, more intimate aspects of Part 2 I really loved do feel like they take a bit of a backseat in favor of other plot lines, as the action becomes more prominent during this section. And since the presentation, like I said before, had been lacking, you don't necessarily get a recipe for super well-received story arcs. I've seen some people say the Jailbreak arc didn't feel as exciting as it could have been. People felt like it ended abruptly, jokes were not hitting, not a whole lot of major developments outside of, well, the obvious stuff. Things like that. I personally still found a lot to enjoy from this section, and I didn't really expect it to be more than it was, but I also don't think expecting more from it is necessarily a bad criticism, because Lord knows I want that from other stories. Okay, that's enough poking fun at JJK for one day. But I do think the arc did a really good job of setting in motion what Chainsaw Man is currently, bringing us back to more familiar territory, if you will. The recent events of the story have been really good, and fans have definitely taken note of this. People are starting to notice this jump in quality, particularly because it's leaning closer to elements that made people fall in love with the series in the first place. Not only becoming more chaotic and unpredictable as chapters go on, but really zeroing in on the character writing. I think Chainsaw Man is really at its best during these moments of introspection and characters sort of connecting with one another. I still think the arcs prior, like the Chainsaw Man Church or Jailbreak arcs, had their fair share of characterization, but to be fair, we did have a lot of characters getting thrown in the mix, which can understandably make things feel a little bit messy to some. Especially when I think that Part 2 is at its strongest when the focus shifts back to Denji, Asa, and Yoru. Even though I actually do like some of the side characters, I think they're pretty funny. But even before all of this, to me, the story has never stopped being Chainsaw Man. The humor, the banter, the situations, the dialogue. To me, it never felt like a different story, but a different side of it, which I really enjoy. Tatsuki Fujimoto has become one of my favorite authors in recent memory. I watched Look Back pretty recently and I thought it was great. Goodbye Eri was great. I heard Fire Punch is also really good. And Chainsaw Man is quickly becoming one of my favorite shonen. I know stocks have been pretty low when it comes to shonen endings, but I do think Fujimoto has proven himself to be an extremely skilled writer that is more than capable of delivering a great ending. That being said, it is entirely possible the ending could fuck everything up, but I'm still here for it either way. And to be honest, I don't really have very specific expectations as to how I think Chainsaw Man should go, in the same way I did for Jujutsu Kaisen. I just really hope it's not a victim of being rushed and ending with a load of forgotten plot points and things of that nature. The most important thing to me is that as long as he nails the major characters, specifically Denji, Asa, and Yoru, that's all I really need.